Thank you so much, everyone, for joining this event, COP26. What does it mean for Exeter? My name's Peter Lefort, so I'm from the University of Exeter, and I run a new project called the Green Futures Network, which I'll say a little bit more about later. But this is very much a collaborative event, got lots of people contributing, and how the event will run is I'm going to first off give a bit of an introduction to what happened at COP26. I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes around some of the outcomes of that, as well as touching on the UK government's net zero strategy and tease out some of the particularly interesting and relevant outcomes and trends that we're seeing. Then we'll hear from a really fantastic panel of people with some really interesting perspectives. We've got Glenn Woodcock, the founder of Exeter City Futures. We've got Jill Westcott, co-chair of Transition Exeter and a parish councillor in Cheriton Bishop in Mid-Devon. We've got Professor Peter Cox, who's a professor of climate system dynamics in mathematics at the University of Exeter. And we've got May here representing Fridays for Future as well. So really great panel, really looking forward to hearing from them. After we've done that and we've had a little bit of time for questions, we'll move into some breakout rooms and explore some of the questions around, okay, where does Exeter go from here? What do we need to do that we're not already doing in response to COP26 and where we are right now in the world, but also in Exeter. I'm going to hand over to Kate, who is helping facilitate the event, to introduce herself and say a little bit more about what's to come. Kate, over to you.
Hello, good afternoon. I'm here from the Living Lab, which is part of the Global Systems Institute at the University of Exeter. It's an interdisciplinary space, so I sit here as somebody who's a musician, a systems convener, and nut about green infrastructure, and community activist in Pinhoe in North Exeter. So the Living Lab is an interdisciplinary space for a systems thinking approach, probably valuable just to unpick that idea of systems thinking. So to bring a holistic approach across a range of different expertise and experience, system thinking brings that different perspective to problem solving in complex situations and complex systems. And my mission for today, as getting everybody together and the panelists, is to ask, what do we start doing differently? How are we going to move forward after COP26? How can we effect change in Exeter? So I'm really looking forward to hearing all of, I'm looking at the chat and can see all of your different perspectives. I'm expecting quite a dynamic and free-ranging conversation. Throw it out there in the chat. I'm really interested. I'll keep an eye, make sure everybody's perspective is woven through as much as I can. If you're being missed, shout. I shall keep an eye. And I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts. Thanks, Peter.
Brilliant. Thanks, Kate. So yeah, that question of what do we need to do differently, thinking about systems, is a really key one for this event. So as I said, I'm going to start us off by kind of looking at the bigger picture, and I'm going to talk a little bit about my experience at COP, but more about I've done a lot of kind of reading and talking with other academics and organisations about what we think has come out of that. This is going to be obviously a subjective interpretation. There are many others out there, so please do share other thoughts in the chat, and we'll have a little bit of time for Q&A after my presentation before we go into the panel and start narrowing it down to a more of an Exeter context. So to say, I'm doing this from the perspective of the work I'm doing at the University of Exeter, the Green Futures Network, which is a new network that's going to launch early next year, aiming to better connect the environmental and climate work that the university does with the real world, effectively, the businesses, local authorities, communities across the Southwest, but also beyond that. So hopefully that's some helpful context, and I will launch into my presentation. So this is what I'm going to talk about, this idea of COP26, the Conference of Parties. But as I said, I'm also going to touch on the net zero strategy. So this was the UK government's first plan for how it's going to meet its targets of halving emissions by 2030 and eliminating them by 2050. So I think we need to look at both of these things in parallel, because the net zero strategy was effectively the UK government's submission, formal submission to COP26. Now, in terms of what happened at COP, there are a few kind of formal things, and I want to kind of touch on some of the headlines, some of which I'll talk about in more detail and some of which I won't. So one of the key things you may well have heard is this idea of keeping 1.5 alive. So this is the idea of a goal of COP26 being keeping the potential to reach only 1.5 degrees of warming, being a kind of a key ambition. We'll talk a little bit more later about whether that happened and also what that actually means. I think that needs a lot of unpacking. Another key aspect of this is that there was an official request in the COP outcomes for new nationally determined contributions next year. So these are the various countries' official submissions for how they're going to reach their targets, what those targets are, getting towards that 1.5 degree ambition. And one of the reasons COP26 there was so much attention paid to it was partly because it was on our doorstep, but partly as well because it was the first COP since Paris where countries had to submit these NDCs. So it was originally to be every 5 years, but because those, for various reasons, including that not being met as much as it could have been at COP this year, there's now a request for countries to resubmit them next year. So moving from every 5 years to every 1 year. Whether or not that happens is to be seen, whether countries respond to that request. But what this does mean is that we're going to see a lot more about the various countries' targets and what they might mean. This is a message that's going to be very dominant in the coming year. And lastly, there were quite a few pledges that were announced, for example, around methane, deforestation, coal, finance. I'm not going to talk about these in any detail, partly because they don't have a huge impact at a local level, and partly because they are just pledges. We don't yet know what they will mean in terms of action. So moving on to some specific ideas, the first thing I want to talk about is the bigger picture. So to think about what happened at COP and what that means, it's really useful to think about, okay, well, what's happened at previous COPs and how does this one compare? So again, touching on Kate's idea of systems thinking about how is the world around us changing? Because we're not going to see the impacts of COP immediately. We will see them over time towards the next conference. It's really useful to think about, okay, what happened after Paris, which was a very big and quite famous COP. And if we look back to 2015, we can see some significant changes. So we've seen real innovation in clean technology. There's been more political resilience to governments responding to the climate emergency nationally and locally. The idea of 1.5 degrees has been normalized. The idea of net zero has been normalized. These ideas are almost ubiquitous now, but they haven't always been. We've seen a shift towards clean energy, and we've seen significant institutional change as well. Now, this is not to say that all of these things are enough and has happened as much as they need to. And it's also not to say that this is all attributed to COP by any stretch. There's been a lot of work by organizations, activists to push this forward. But it is helpful to see how the world has changed. Secondly, one thing that we've really seen is an increased acceptance of the science as well. If we compare to COP24 3 years ago, at that COP, there was a real push from some countries to keep the IPCC's 1.5 degree report out of the official COP documentation. But this year, it was front and center. So we've really seen a trend towards the acceptance of the science, which is significant and definitely should be recognized. And thirdly, fossil fuels as an example. There's been a lot of language around fossil fuels as a toxic asset, specifically coal. Here are a couple of quotes about coal. So Jennifer Morgan says the era of coal is ending. The UK government's own press release says the end of coal is in sight. And obviously there's a big gap between these words being said and these things happening. But again, these are shifts. This is new language being used by people and organizations who haven't used this kind of language before, and this is significant. So looking at specific things that are coming out of COP. So this idea of 1.5 degrees, I really want to touch on, because I think, again, this is a number that is going to be, it's already everywhere, but it's going to be more and more repeated as we go forward. And that I think we need to collectively examine our relationship with this number. This is a fantastic graph from the excellent Carbon Brief, who've got some really good work on demystifying what happened at COP. And what this is telling us is basically looking at, well, okay, if all of the commitments and promises that were made last year, before COP this year, and at COP this year are met, what does that mean for the level of warming we're likely to see? And what we can see here is the most optimistic scenario we have on the right-hand side in the dark blue is 1.8 degrees. So this is obviously significantly above 1.5. And there's a few things to say about this. Around the question of how do we engage with this idea of 1.5? And firstly is, as you all probably know, this is not a safety net. 1.5, when it was brought up, was very much about, this is going to be, we need to hit this if we're going to avoid catastrophic change. But we're learning more and more about what that level of warming actually means. We're looking at 1.1, 1.2 at the moment, and we're already seeing significant changes. So we really need to combat this idea of 1.5 being a safety net, being a target we have to aim for, and then things will be okay. That is not how it works. And every fraction of a degree above, below that is going to bring different changes and different consequences. And secondly, this is based on uncertainty. This is the best data that we have, but it is, of course, not an exact science. We're projecting, we're modeling, and you might be able to see on this graph that below the larger temperatures, there's a temperature range, which represents the range of the uncertainty within that number. So again, taking this 1.5 degree potential on the right-hand side, underneath that, the range could be anywhere from 1.5 to 2.4, which is obviously a huge range, which brings with it a lot of uncertainty. So as we see governments, organizations talking more and more about this idea of 1.5, we all have to locally think about what's our relationship to that. How do we want to engage with this as a target, which can be useful to have, but the uncertainty and the danger that lies within that. It's a definite trend we need to address. Secondly, I want to talk about behavioral trends. So these are some things we can really notice about what the language that's being used in and around COP and what that means for behavioral trends locally. So if we think about behavior change specifically, this is the kind of language that national government is using around COP and in the net zero strategy. So we've got things like UK government want to go with the grain of existing behavior and trends. Expecting the British public to forego holidays abroad would be an enormous political challenge. So what we're seeing here is really a delegation of responsibility by the national government around behavior change. So they do not want to put in place policies that will create a painful transition. They're very much focused on a painless transition. But we know that behavior change is going to be a huge part of our response to the climate emergency. So at the moment, that looks like that is falling to us at a local level, as local councils, as organizations, as communities. This is going to be a huge part of it, of our response. And currently the top-down infrastructure is questionable. There's a graph from a Guardian article about some data looking at what would people do personally to the language here, preserve the planet. Some interesting things to pick out here. 46% of people saying, I don't really think I need to change my habits. And then above that, there's more and more people saying, I need money, support, guidance, resources in order to be able to do these things. And at the top, 76% of people saying that they would accept stricter rules and environmental regulations. So they would accept the kind of behavior change that comes from above, which is exactly the kind of behavior change that we're seeing less of. So this is clearly a complex problem and a challenge that we haven't yet figured out. And this is something at a local level really needs to be a priority. Secondly, around behavioral trends, really important to think about how is this being framed in the global context. And by this, effectively, what we're talking about is who are we going to blame? Are we going to blame China? Are we going to blame India? There's a lot of language around apportioning blame for climate change. Some of the headlines coming out of COP, The Sun here talking about Russia, China, and India. The Guardian reporting about Alok Sharma's frustration with India and China. And these are not new ideas. This is a cartoon from Paris 2015, effectively blaming India for getting in the way of progress. And not only are these fairly colonial and often racist ideas, these are really, they don't stand up to scrutiny. Every country has its own barriers in addressing its own emissions and its own contribution to climate change. Doesn't take into account corporations, which obviously work across borders as well. And this is something that as more and more awareness is raised around climate change at a local level, these are currently the messages that are being shared. So these are the messages, again, we need to think about how we going to combat these, how we're going to replace these, and help people focus more positively rather than messages that could create more division. And next, I want to talk about climate adaptation. So this is something that there wasn't a huge amount about at COP. There was more than there has been before, but much of it was focused on the global south and countries that are already experiencing significant climatic changes, not so much about a local impact. But this, again, is something that we are learning more and more about, and really the data, our knowledge of how the climate is going to change locally is far outstripping our policies and our business plans and our strategies for how we're going to respond to that. So just to share some of the types of information that's out there, this is Climate Central. They've got a great map that's looking at projected areas that are going to be below annual flood levels in the coming decades. So where we're likely to see flooding if we're not already. So we have this information. But again, what we really need to add to it is the local knowledge of, okay, when those things happen, what does that mean to the infrastructure? What does that mean on a systemic level? When you show people graphs like this or maps, the first thing people tend to do is look at their house and think, oh, is my house okay? But of course, then they're not necessarily thinking about, well, what about my route to hospital or how I get to work or where I get my food from? So we really need to bring in the local knowledge of what this means at a systemic level. It's not just about flooding as well. So these are graphs that we've got from a project that we're developing at the university with Cornwall Council, looking at how to support decision-making about climate adaptation. So what we've done here is taken data from the Met Office, turned it into graphs that show, okay, so for this part of Cornwall, this is what we're likely to see in terms of maximum temperature in the summer and the winter. And again, we're obviously seeing increases in that maximum temperature, which will bring with it heat waves and various other issues. We can also look at rainfall. What we're seeing here is a trend towards wetter winters and drier summers. And again, we need to think, well, what are the local impacts of that going to be? Wetter winters is likely going to affect mold in properties and health. It's going to affect how we travel and move around. Drier summers is likely to affect how we grow food and lots of other aspects. So thinking about, again, what are the local impacts? How is this going to change our communities? There is going to be more and more support for adaptation measures, but at the moment there is a bit of a gap there, and that's a gap that really is falling to us at a local level. Then I wanted to mention business incentives. So this is really important, thinking about, well, where do businesses stand now in a kind of a post-COP world? And there's a couple of things that I think are important to touch on. One is around measurement and disclosure. So this is effectively, what are you doing as a business and what have you already done? This is one graph of many that are online. So I've just taken this from the New Climate Institute, and it's showing basically that the trend is ever upwards in terms of the number of businesses that are disclosing their emissions. So this is the significant trend we are seeing. It's becoming easier, but also there's more incentives, and soon enough it will become almost impossible for businesses not to do this. So we have to think about, okay, at a local level, do we have the capacity to support businesses, large and small, to do this if they're not already? Is the expertise here? Are the resources and the tools here? Because more and more or businesses will be left behind if they are not able to do this effectively. And the second part of business incentives is thinking about how is the risk changing for businesses to act on climate change. Doing anything different is always a risk. But here's a quote from McKinsey in the wake of COP that I think is significant. They're saying momentum has shifted towards net zero, providing businesses with a new organizing principle. And this is a pretty significant thing to say for an organization of McKinsey's size, effectively saying, with the language that we've seen about fossil fuels being a toxic asset, the various commitments that are being made, while the action isn't necessarily there, it is providing a significant de-risking for businesses to engage in this and to put their money, put their time, put their investment into net zero. It's becoming clearer and clearer that that is the commitment for where we are going. And again, we might have that frustration that it's not enough and we're not moving fast enough, but we do have to recognize these shifts when they occur so that we can find that local leadership to help businesses respond to that and identify this. And the last thing specifically before I wrap up is thinking about, okay, well, what about specific sectors? What are we seeing? And there's two aspects I want to bring to this. One is looking at the Glasgow Breakthroughs, which was a set of agreements signed by 40 countries, including the UK, US, China, Australia, India, looking at where do we want to be by 2030. You can see these are broken down into 5 categories: power, road transport, steel, hydrogen, and agriculture. Don't feel like you need to read through all of those. The key thing here is that they're all looking at 2030, where do we want to be? Thinking about the new normal, thinking about how things are created. And a key thing here is to say, yes, there aren't clear plans for how this is going to happen. This isn't a really detailed roadmap, but this is a shared commitment. So again, it's not about, oh, fine, everyone, it's solved and we don't have to do anything. This is the language. This is new, and we really need to hold countries and organizations to account on this. I think it's also important, though, to look at, okay, well, within our net zero strategy within the UK, where have we got more or less detail? Where are the things where we can really see where things are going to, how things are going to change, and where are the gaps? So just picking 3 example headlines from the breakthroughs, looking at agriculture, for example. We still don't have a clear and credible strategy of how we're going to address agriculture emissions, which for rural areas is obviously a significant issue, not just in terms of creating emissions, but also the potential to capture and store those, and how land is used and soil is managed. Power, you've probably heard about the plans for decarbonisation by 2035, and there's a bit more clarity about what that looks like. Electrification, low carbon hydrogen. So again, there's slightly more in terms of a roadmap. And then with road transport, again, you're probably familiar with the ambitions to end the sale of combustion engine cars and vans by 2030. Bit more clarity here in terms of the grants that will be available and the charging infrastructure that will be in place. But still, there are gaps. We don't know yet what's going to happen around HGVs or coaches or motorbikes, for example. So in some areas, there's real detail, and in some areas, we're still missing a lot. So just to wrap up, I want to kind of offer a bit of a summary, just throwing a lot of information at you. And these are the things for me, I think, that are really useful at a local level. So firstly is we do really need to focus on what happened, not to celebrate it and say it was enough and that's fine and everyone did a great job, but to recognize what's happened and use that to accelerate forward. Okay, this is where we are, now we go forward. And the key good thing about acceleration is it doesn't have to happen in a straight line. So we really need to think about where is change happening in a non-linear way. Some really good research being done at the university at the moment about positive tipping points, and this idea that the change we want to see doesn't necessarily happen at the same speed. It can be very, very slow as the conditions are created, and then it can happen very, very quickly. So how do we notice that? And specifically thinking about opportunities for businesses, we might see a kind of a slow growth then, but that is going to change very rapidly. And as that does, we think about, are we ready for it? Behavior change also, we need to think about how do we get that kind of critical mass of behavior locally to be where we need it to be. It doesn't all have to happen at the same time or at the same speed, but we do need to get to that tipping point. And then lastly on that, this is about recognizing where are the lines in the sand that we're not going to go behind, like fossil fuels being a toxic asset, and how do we make sure we keep pushing those forward? So stand our ground on what's already been said and keep pushing that forward. Thirdly, oh, I've missed out 3, hopefully that will come back. Fourthly, academics are a great resource. We need to use them even more. So there's not just at the University of Exeter, there's fantastic academic institutions across the Southwest, the country, the world, and more, I think, we need to tap into that data that's telling us what is likely to happen, what do we know, and how do we kind of build that into what we're doing. There's number 3, climate adaptation, which I mentioned. So really thinking about how are we going to be affected here and now, both directly in terms of how we're going to see the weather changing and impacting our houses, our streets, but also indirectly. How is it going to impact the systems in which we live in, how we get food, how we communicate, how we work, and really kind of digging down into that, I think is more and more important. And then lastly, to recognize that change is happening. It is happening. It's not happening fast enough, but it is happening. And what we need to do is act as though the next changes that we need are inevitable, because they are. We just haven't quite caught up to the political will lining up with the technological capacity and the scientific understanding. But these changes are going to happen, and we need to start acting now as though that change is coming right now. It's a kind of a new way of thinking about resilience. Because we are living now in a post-COP26 world, and it doesn't necessarily feel that clear what that means just yet, but it is something we will be able to look back on, and it is something where we need to draw that line in the sand and say, okay, great, this is where we are now, this is what we do going forward. So really thinking that question about what do we start doing differently now? That is, I think, the call to action that we need.
Thank you, Peter. That was thought-provoking and provocative. For anybody, I mean, sometimes I myself, I feel things are completely overwhelming. The flip side for looking at systems with a systems thinking approach is that you're looking at everything, and everything can be overwhelming. So one of the great quotes that I had from a community action group yesterday was the importance of sharing our story so as we can write it together. So I would just encourage everybody that sense of we're here for that discussion so we can contribute to change. We're here because we know it's coming, we can shape it, and that's what we'd like to do with this discussion and the questions that we're raising today. So thank you to all the panelists for coming. I'm really looking forward to hearing from everybody. I'm going to be fairly tight on 5 minutes, but I'm never the best timekeeper myself, so kick me, Peter, if I'm being too generous. So thank you, and I'm just going to go straight into, I've got on my list here Glenn. So Glenn Woodcock from Exeter City Futures. Glenn, if you'd like to just sort of introduce yourself and rock with your 5 minutes.
Okay, well, as you say, I'm the founder of Exeter City Futures, but I'm a director of Oxygen House and director of a company called Low Carbon Group, which is an investor in renewable energy and other things as well. I think, Peter, your presentation was absolutely fantastic in a really structured and data-driven way. I thought you hit all the keynotes, so much so that I've just had to rewrite what I was going to say. But I find so, and first of all, I attended COP21 myself with a focus on finance in Paris. And I just want to say something about that because it is something that has changed massively. So in Paris, we held a number of roundtables with large institutional investors, pension funds, insurance companies. And it was very clear at that point that that climate change would not overcome economic rationality. And economic rationality for them was to invest in what gives the largest return today without taking into account uncalculatable impacts of things like climate change. And that has changed. That has absolutely changed. I mean, there was a conversation that I had, you know, I will say the name of it, with the Church of England Asset Management Company, who said exactly that. They had to invest to make maximum return for the Church of England, and that they would only invest in things like renewable energy if it also made the same maximum market level of return. Everybody has changed on that now. And in fact, we've seen quite a few really large-scale deals that have happened in the last 12 months, indeed in the last few months, which are about shifting assets into that massive level of renewable energy investment we need to see across the whole of the globe. So that is a great positive. I also agree the other great positive is the Fridays for Future movement, because I think without that, we wouldn't have had the certainly the UK-wide level of grassroots and local government commitment towards net zero. Nobody knows what that means, but it is a really big statement that's been made and has been made since Paris. So I think those two things are incredibly positive steps forward. And I agree with Peter that one of the big problems we have is that our politicians, as it stands, are not having a debate with us about how our society needs to change. And that kind of go with the grain comment, I think, was probably one of the most disappointing and even dangerous bits of positioning that came out of COP26. And that relates, of course, directly to what we have to do at a local level. And I think it's really important, it's really important not to say that is the Conservative government that's doing that, because there's really very little difference between our two main parties on this issue. Neither are willing to engage with us as to what the changes we need to make will really mean. And that does start to relate to what does net zero mean? Because if we're not willing to give up our foreign holidays as a whole nation, that means we need to offset them. If we're not willing to give up having a new car every 4 years, we have to offset that. If we're not willing to give up high levels of meat and dairy in our diets, we have to offset that. If we're not willing to give up fast fashion in some way, shape or form, we have to offset that. And in the end, you can't, with such a long list of things that need to be offset, and such a kind of a poverty of resource on the offsetting side, we're kind of making a mockery of that. The reality is, and I think it would be great to see more conclusive research on this, you know, I mean, a call, I think, to the University of Exeter and others is to say, could you tell us what the offsetting budget realistically would be for a city? How much can we rely on to offset? And therefore, how much change do we really need to make? And I think that would be a useful input to the debate. And I mean, if it already exists, then it would be, I think it would be, we need to distribute that more widely. At a local level, there are actually quite a lot of things that we can do differently, but we're not doing them differently. And again, I mean, that's actually a reflection of our political will. And when I say political will at a local level, that's our aggregate will. It's how much are we as a population willing to pull and demand different types of change. And that really is reflected in that really fantastic chart which Peter showed, which is around kind of people's willingness to visualize differences in their own lives versus their willingness to simply be told what to do. And I think that is a real catch-22 situation that we've got, and it's only going to change from the bottom up. So we, as a population and as a city, need to start to engage in as positive way as possible, to say, what do we want Exeter to look like in the future? The other test of our imagination is to think through what those changes are going to be and to think of them in a positive way. So think about how driving less, how having less foreign holidays, how eating less meat, etc., would actually improve our lives, and how, in fact, it might be something that we aspire to. because that's really the only way we're going to build a greater level of popular support for the kinds of changes that we need to demand from our local and from our national government. I think the final thing I'd like to say is that, you know, at a political level in Exeter, there have been some really fantastic positive statements and a lot of really strong outline support from our local council and from surrounding councils, but they don't know what they're allowed to do. And this is again, it's another catch-22 of politics, is they could make some suggestions for some quite drastic change and experience a great deal of pushback from the local community. And whilst you might say it's their job to persuade, I think often politicians would say it's their job to represent. So unless we start to build a greater level of groundswell, visionary groundswell, across a wider proportion of our local population, the changes that we can make now will take a lot longer than they need to. So I think, you know, my final real takeaway of what does COP26 mean at the level of a city like Exeter is, as Peter says, they pass the ball to us, and it is down to us to find the way forward in these issues.
Thank you, Glenn. You ran into that space of me being flexible. Thank
Sorry.
you for that. Totally great. I know there are going to be lots of follow-up questions for you specifically with an Exeter perspective and your roles in different organisations across the city as to how we can encourage some engagement more with those questions. But I'm, for the moment, logging the questions in the chat. Thank you, and please everybody do put them there, keep putting them there. And now I'm going to ask Jill Westcott from Transition Exeter, if Jill, if you would take your 5 minutes. Thank you.
Oh, Jill, you're still on mute, Jill.
Thank you. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, perfect.
That's great. Okay. So I don't know if you can share my screen, if you can see my screen now. Can you see it?
Yeah, looks good.
Yeah. Okay, great. There we go. So speaking from Transition Exeter's point of view, some of this is stuff that we have been doing for a while, and some of it is new. So I'm going to just quickly whisk through some of the things we've been doing over the past decade and a half. A lot of it has to do with public awareness, but also enabling people to participate in changing their city. And I so much agreed with, I think it was Reza who raised the issue of agency. And I think unless people are more than aware, and COP26 gave great opportunities for increased public awareness, unless people feel they can do something, then they will freeze or become apathetic or become despairing. And so we all have opportunities, but sometimes those opportunities only exist if we get together. So to enable that, we have a constant flow of large meetings, other activities in public, and at our recent Connecting Exeter workshop, this is some of the stuff that we did. We also ran an Imagine Better workshop. We'd like to do more of helping people to have positive visions. And I love that visionary groundswell, Glenn. I do agree we need more of that. It's not enough, but it'll give us a good start. So one of the things we do is do it differently and share the experience. So two of these pictures are about a community 10-mile dinner where people brought food from within 10 miles, shared it. We had a wonderful time, lots of music, singing. We had been selling local vegetables in the park for some weeks prior to that, and some people weren't familiar with these vegetables or hadn't thought of using them they're in season. And at the bottom, we have one of our green homes tours. And it may be that we need to do some more of those, to poke around each other's houses and see what we've done to make our homes more energy efficient, and ask those questions like, how much does it cost? Would you recommend your installer? Or to install renewable energy? One or two of you might recognize some people there. So the other thing is essential is for people to be able to earn a living in ways that are compatible with our zero carbon future. So the social enterprises that have come from Transition Exeter include the Real Food Store, which I hope is going to be open, Exeter Community Growers, where anyone can go and participate and take away produce, Exeter Community Energy, which has some quite big renewable installations around Exeter. And currently, some of the things we're doing include our Green Space Exeter, so Facebook group, which allows people to say what's important about the green spaces within Exeter to them. And we're very aware of the difficulty of maintaining these green spaces and the threats to them, particularly on the northern skyline. So this is a support group for people who want to do that. So I'm going to stop screen sharing now and just say a little bit more about which COP26 outcomes feel most important. And Glenn, thank you very much. I agree. Lack of urgency is very important and means that we're going to have to put a lot more energy into adaptation. And hopefully adaptation that doesn't make the problem worse. So things like being aware of the potential for greater degrees of flooding. We have got flood defence works, but even the heavier rainfall we're expecting, and it will come heavier, can race down roads like a river, block drains, cause all sorts of problems. And this will be particularly the case with more building on higher ground. That will enable a quicker runoff. Whereas maintaining natural space and maybe rain gardens within the city that contain water and hold it will make it easier for us and reduce that runoff. More local food will help us to be resilient, as well as to adapt to possible disruptions of global supply chains. But I think on the issue of people's awareness of this issue, it's part of our job to make it easier for them to respond, partly by bringing people together. But the response doesn't just have to be technical. And it doesn't just have to be about changing our lifestyles, although that's really important. And we probably all need support to change our lifestyles. For example, many of us have got families in different countries. I'm lucky that I don't have, but other people want to see their grandchildren. So, you know, should perhaps the rest of us cut back even more so that those people can visit their families? I don't know, but there's a conversation to have. And how do we do without this? And how do we relinquish that? And what good things could we have if we change our lives? There's lots to help us get our heads around it. But our response also has to be emotional and political, as has already been pointed out. So it's much too big a problem to cope with on our own and individually, even if we can make individual changes. So we do need to share our reactions. Climate anxiety is so widespread, especially among young people throughout the world. More than half young people are really worried about it. So there need to be opportunities for mourning. Am I up to 5 minutes?
Yeah, I'm going to have to be tougher,
okay.
I can see.
Okay.
But thank you.
Can I just say three things on the gaps? Methane, they didn't discuss meat. That's our job. And what sort of meat? Near at hand, nicely produced. Electric cars aren't the answer, we've said that. And water and oceans, what we put into our rivers and oceans, will determine the oxygen supply for the world and also how much carbon can be sequestrated by the ocean. And we've lost 40% of our plankton, which do that job. So there are 3 things we need to work more on. And if anyone's interested in working with Transition Exeter, please get in touch via the website.
Thank you. And you got in the final promo bit. Listen, there will be plenty of time for that. And I'm going to weave through all the opportunities to connect for everybody. That's one of the central things we're trying to do today, is to bring everybody together. So absolutely take that, be sure. I'm really pleased that Professor Peter Cox, Professor of Climate Systems Dynamics is going to give us 5 minutes.
Thank you, Kate.
I can't see. Yeah, thank you very much.
You see me okay? Thanks very much. I'm not going to show any slides because I didn't prepare any, but I've got a few comments. I was the one person who was cautiously optimistic in the survey to reveal something that Peter didn't. And that's basically, I think, because I had lower expectations than the rest of you. I went to my first COP, which was COP6 in the year 2000, just before George W. Bush won the first term. And we thought then that that was the one that would push over top-down action. And I've thought that at Copenhagen, I've thought that at Paris. And it's just coming to my dense mind that that's not the way it works. That's not the way change works. And I think the way change is working is something Peter had alluded to and other comments have alluded to. It happens in a bottom-up way. And in a sense, what I thought about COPs before was that they made things happen in a very top-down way. And I was working for the Met Office, which was a very hierarchical organisation at the time. Now I work in the university and I'm a bit older and a bit more wizened. It doesn't seem like that's the way it works. Actually, what those organisations do is they can enable, encourage, and at the moment, more and more raise the profile. So COP26 was huge because so many people were engaged in it. Exeter had a great showing, by the way. It's a parochial thing, but I think it was a brilliant performance by Exeter in the things it was involved in. So progress is slow, but the groundswell is unique. And that's where I'm optimistic, because I think that's where the change comes from. On 1.5, I think we've got a real problem because 1.5 targets are set in these negotiations to be to motivate action. And it looks very much like 1.5 is going to be missed now. I mean, scientists thought that at the time of Paris. I did at the time of Paris. We went to Paris to say, we're going for 2.7 or higher. You're not anywhere near 2. And we were told 1.5 is what we're going to do. And we all thought, well, that's great, 1.5. But actually, we've not made any progress on it. There are pledges that would keep us, if we believe them all, maybe below 2, but not get to 1.5. And we've got, at current rates of emissions, we've got 10 years of emissions left, and then no more emissions, none at all. No, you know, you can't offset everything. You've got no more emissions left. So we are very likely to miss 1.5. And the issue is how much can we reduce that amount by, and what are the consequences? So here's a parochial thing again. Questions are being posed to scientists now, like how dangerous is such and such an overshoot of 1.5? And a lot of that comes down to whether you think there are abrupt changes called tipping points in the system, and we are uniquely well placed to look at some of those questions. Peter, in his excellent opening talk, also explained that at Exeter and elsewhere, I hope more and more, we are encouraging the application of those ideas about abrupt change, not to the problem, you know, abrupt impacts, but to the solutions. And if anything is clear, it is that the socioeconomic domain and opinion is more prone to abrupt change than the physical climate system. And that's a reason for hope. So we're seeing it already. I mean, the ultimate abrupt change in the climate system was not anything the climate system did, but it was the Industrial Revolution, which was an abrupt change in socioeconomics. The most significant abrupt change in climate policy discussions is the development of grassroots activities and pressure. And this is new. This is really new. If you think about what we've got now, even prior to Paris, it's much more significant. Governments like ours don't do anything unless the people require it of them. And I think we're close to that stage now. So that's why I'm optimistic, but it's not because I believe the COPs are going to solve this. I believe there just comes a time when they just help us to raise the profile. So the group momentum that we're getting now is enough to make change happen. And it's not just about grassroots movements, although they're key. It's also about stimulating business thinking about these things. And I can start to see that happening. The target 1.5 is a big problem though. And we will have we have a sort of issue about when we front up to the fact we're likely to miss this. At the moment, the sort of PR from the COP26 was that 1.5 was still alive, and we're thinking, well, really? I mean, it's really, really tough. So And there are people, there are young people that email me and they think 1.5 is the drop dead time. And I really worry about that because of their mental health, but also because it means people have a tendency to give up. And as Peter also said, the key thing here is that every 0.1 of a degree matters in terms of impacts. So I think there's a difficult messaging thing here. It's not being grasped, but at some point we have to say, we're going to miss 1.5, but for goodness sake, let's not take our foot off the gas and end up 2 or 3, which is where we were going to before Paris. We are now at a situation where we're probably going to stay below 3 if people do what they said. Going to get closer to 2, but probably miss it. But 1.5 is probably going to still be missed by quite a way. And we want to avoid overshooting by a lot. So I'm going to finish now, I think, and just say, I think there are some taboos that will come out, I hope, in the next, in discussion about 1.5. So there's a sort of, if you stick to the idea that 1.5 is a target that must not be missed, or that must not be exceeded, then you're left with a couple of drastic things. One is a thing called solar radiation management, which is essentially to block some of the sun out or reflect some of the sun by putting particles in the stratosphere. It could be done. Most people would not find it palatable. It's not discussed at all. And the other is to recognize, for nations to recognize that even though they are decarbonizing, they're not decarbonizing as quickly as their economies are growing. And so there is an issue about whether we should be thinking about whether it's easier to reduce economic growth than it is to decarbonize. You certainly need economic growth to be slower than decarbonisation rate to get emissions down. And that is still, I think, largely a taboo. So with that, thanks, folks.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Peter. Several themes there I'd really like to make time to pick up. But firstly, let's go to May, who's here from Fridays for Future. And Peter, really, you gave a fantastic introduction to May and the importance of all of the great work that Fridays for Future are doing for all of us. The floor is yours, May.
I'm May, and as you know, I'm from Fridays for Future Exeter, which I am 14 now, and I've been organising climate work and doing climate work since I was 10, I think, so 4 years now. So I was meant to be going to some COP protests and events, but I caught COVID, so I couldn't go, but I'm better now. But a few of my friends from Fridays for Future went, and they were telling me how disappointed they were in COP in general. I think the majority of us from Fridays for Future are pretty gutted because our whole campaigns have been to stay below 1.5 degrees, and then they committed to staying below 2.4 degrees, which is obviously a big gap. And also the IPCC have obviously highlighted that we need to stay under 1.5 for a livable planet, though quite a lot of my friends from Fridays for Future who went said that it was really good to be united as one and to think about what we personally need to do as a smaller community. I think that it's really important we continue acting and doing strikes and protests to try and raise more awareness to get what we want achieved, because I think since Greta Thunberg became involved in the media, probably don't know how many years ago now, but several years ago, the climate change has become a much more popular topic to talk about. It's become a lot more in the media and stuff. Still not enough by a long way, but I think it's created a lot of talk about the crisis. So I think that if we continue protesting, we can make quite a lot of change and demand for the next COP what we want governments to do and to stay below 1.5. Though I think this needs to happen like right now. We all need to act now, because we can't keep saying we can't keep waiting for the next COP and make a decision now. And also a positive of COP is, like I said before, I think quite a lot of people, they felt empowered by it, from young people and also older people who were all participating in the Extinction Rebellion and Fridays for Future protests. Also, how we can reduce our emissions as a county is, so they've made quite a lot of empty promises before, but the UK government promised to reduce agriculture emissions at COP. I'm hoping they will keep their promise this time, particularly as 16% of Devon's carbon emissions come from agriculture and forestry and land use. So if we reduce those emissions as a country, Devon can have quite a big impact on the overall carbon emissions from the country. So yeah, I think I became personally interested in the environment because it will impact my future, my generation, and my future, my children's future, etc., etc. And I think quite a lot of people my age, they feel, quite a lot of people I know, they feel anxious and unempowered. Fridays for Future have worked with a youth climate mental health charity called Force of Nature, and they did a recent study on young people, like a big survey, and it showed that over 70% of young people feel hopeless when it comes to the climate crisis. And I think that for me personally, Fridays for Future and movements like that and Extinction Rebellion have made me feel a lot more empowered. And I think if we continue working with these movements and don't give up, we can make a big impact, and we have to keep on acting as a community and as a county. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you for ending on such a positive note, May. And I would say from very many of us in the room, Fridays for Future has been inspirational. And I'd like to thank all the young people who make that stand for themselves and for all of us. I'll pick up also your connection to XR, also in the chat. Great work is being done. So I'm just going to, okay, so Peter, you're going to add a couple of minutes to the Q&A. Thank you. I'd like to pick up a couple of things for our four panelists, just to put some detail on a couple of ideas before we lead into the breakout rooms. So what we're really hoping from the breakout rooms is we can get some specific ideas about how Exeter can move forward. What can we do for positive change in Exeter? So there are a couple of things that I wanted to pick up on. Growth and the idea of picking up from Diana in the chat, the idea of clean growth. So Exeter as a city is kind of marking its growth agenda. Glenn, I just wonder, as Exeter City Futures is leading that net zero agenda for Exeter City Council, can you unpick that that sense of, you say offsetting is a question we need to consider when we're looking at, you know, kind of, will we have reduce our foreign holidays or offset? How realistic do you think that offsetting option is, and how do you feel Exeter could approach that through its net zero agenda?
I think the idea of net zero is very new to people, and so in organisations that so I'm involved with quite a lot of organisations, and in the ones where they are thinking through their own net zero journey, they are reaching for I mean, it's quite natural to say, well, I see we've got to decarbonise, but I don't really see how we can do it. And so the assumption is they'll have to offset a lot of what they do. And everyone's doing that. And I think that Peter really made the point. There is very little in terms of offset opportunity. I think it's helped us move forward, but it's created a new problem for us, which is to say, well, what does it really mean? My personal view is that we will have to work through the issues of realizing that when you look at what we're going to do as a city, we're not going to be able to rely very much on offsetting. So we need to think about what a true zero carbon place looks like. But other people will disagree with me on that, and I think we've got to go through that debate. Because if you take my point of view, then we won't be going on foreign holidays. But that's just my personal point of view. And of course, the whole point of something like Exeter City Futures is to go through that debate, because you can't tell people what that's going to be. And I think on the point of growth, Jill said it. I think some things will have to grow, and other things will have to shrink. Some things will have to grow a lot, and other things will have to shrink a lot. And what that means in terms of reuse of things and circular economy and how you end up redefining growth, I think is really kind of unclear. And so we've got to work through that as well. And so there's so much that we have got to come to improved consensus on.
Okay, so I'm going to note the circular economy. There's a Devon Donut economics group that I'm not sure if there's anybody here, but I'd be really interested to know from the chat. Thank you, because different economic models and how that might influence the council's decision is a really important discussion. Also want to pick up the idea of community engagement, Jill, from you. One of the great moments of the transition movement is imagination, and I love Rob Hopkins' book What If, and that idea of introducing communities, the idea of you don't have to things don't have to be as they are, and just crossing that it's difficult for so many people to give up their feeling of doom about nothing is ever going to change into that moment where what can you imagine? How can you imagine your future will be different? So Jill, can you say anything about Exeter specifically? As you know, the Green Skyline is led by a petition that I ran in Pinhoe and the Northern Hills and all of those things, that we have 2,000 people, over 2,000 people signing the petition in Exeter, saying how strongly they feel about protecting that green space. And yet Exeter, if it has a growth agenda, needs more housing. How's transition?
Okay, you've given me quite a bundle there. Thanks, Kate.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah, visioning is really important. Rob takes people on a little journey to 2030. You've probably been in a whole room who go in the time machine and then share what we experienced there, which is a fantastic exercise. And we've also done other variations. If you would like to see a little 2-minute video of one of these visions that Hopkins himself made, I'll put it in chat after. So definitely, but also telling stories about what's being done elsewhere. So we heard Councillor Clyde Noakes talk about how they made Waltham Forest safe for cycling and walking and so on, and put low traffic neighbourhoods into those neighbourhoods that in a consultation said they wanted them. And people were so pleased at it. These little sort of shopping areas, suburban shop, found that people were more keen to go there because they could sit outside in peace and tables and it smelt nice and so on. And then the other areas came and said, well, actually, we'd quite like a low traffic neighbourhood as well. So we would like to organise a trip to Waltham Forest to see around what they've been doing. And perhaps there'll be some help for us in Exeter to know how we can do that, how we can communicate about it, and how we can overcome the difficulties that people might experience with mobility and so on. Milton Keynes has put in place sustainable building rules which insist on sustainable building materials as well as houses that are low carbon in operation. Perhaps we could learn something from that. So I think we need to tell these stories and come together and inform each other. Now, I don't know if that answers your question, but the donut is another thing. I mean, I'm involved in donut economics, and the Devon donut is really worth looking at. But the principle is so much more important. It says, let's go for what we really want. Let's not bypass to economic growth. Let's go for the SDGs, the basic social underpinning within planetary boundaries. It's great.
Okay, that's really useful and provocative, I hope, for our breakout rooms to bounce that around and discuss. Peter, I know that you're dashing off for lectures fairly soon, so I just want to pick up on that idea of participation and the connection to the expertise at the university. How do you feel in terms of communicating your message, or the expertise that you have? Are there mechanisms that you can imagine? Are there platforms that you would like to see that would enable the university to connect to communities in Exeter who will be looking at what changes they might need to make personally? How can we connect that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're trying to do that already, Kate. Patrick Divine Wright, that some of you may know, is what's called the Global Climate Advocate at the university, and is responsible for connecting to Exeter and Devon and Cornwall, and does a lot of work on that front. We've got many academics who'd like to be engaged in that too. But I also think the grassroots movements are really well informed in general. Sometimes I think we have to correct the more doom-laden things, which might lead to complete despair and a lack of action. But on the whole, I think people are pretty well informed on this. I would say, just before I go, one of the big concerns, and Peter had sort of hinted at this, is that I feel that some of the processes that we're using now, like COP and the net zero targets, are now being distrusted by those grassroots movements. And I can understand why that is, but it's absolutely critical that those grassroots movements get behind pushing them along, especially net zero. So net zero is indeed incredibly vague, but that means we've still got a chance to get it done in a meaningful way. The last thing that I would like to see is that net zero is kind of dropped because it looks like it's full of loopholes, rather than because it's vague. We insist as the people that it should not involve major offsetting, it should involve meaningful actions. So I would say the governments have actually, like our government, have signed up to something that's really difficult to meet, actually, such that we could get them to do something very meaningful on the basis of existing targets rather than giving up on them. So that's another reason for hope, but we do need to avoid a major divide between the groups that are providing the grassroots pressure and the people involved in policy decisions and the science. If we can keep those two together, and communication is part of it, Kate, then I think we've got the sort of momentum you need to make a change. Sorry, I'm going to have to go, folks. I have to go lecture now, but it's been a great pleasure.
That's fantastic. Thank you ever so much, Peter. Thank you.
Thank you.
And that really leads beautifully on to May. I'm really interested to know, how accessible do you feel the expertise from the university, from the experts and the perspective within the city? Do you find that accessible, useful? How can we communicate better from this grassroots activism to the broad community engagement? Can you speak about that at all?
Thanks for that. I think that, yeah, there's a lot of information which is very useful from the University of Exeter, and in Exeter particularly. I know quite a lot, I have quite a lot of friends, know quite a lot of people from the university, because my dad worked there at one point, who have similar opinions on climate change. I think the main sort of effort is communicating and appealing to sort of people in more rural communities. So I live in quite a rural area. I go to to school. One of the teachers from my school is here. I go to quite a rural school, and I think lots of the teachers there are quite supportive and understand the issue, though some of the children haven't really had the education about how it will impact their future. Force of Nature, which I mentioned earlier, did a survey for teachers as well, and it shows that 3/4 of teachers feel unequipped teaching children about the climate crisis. My mum, she's a teacher, and she says that when she talks about climate change to her pupils at Exeter College, even though they're like 16, 17, quite a lot of them don't understand. So yeah, I think that we really need to communicate to the younger community about how it will impact their future. I've only got only 2 or 3 of my friends agree with Fridays for Future and protesting and stuff. So at school, quite a lot of people don't understand and they think I'm just like overreacting. So I think also young people don't necessarily understand that we want systematic change. They're always like, oh, what are you doing? Or, oh, your book's made of paper. So yeah, and I think I think we need to unify people. We need to connect all generations and have more adequate climate education. Thank you.
Brilliant. I think that's really interesting, certainly from my teenager who's been part of Fridays for Future. There is an antagonistic relationship often with the people in her class. So I think we have several themes here: that communication, climate anxiety, agency to effect systems change. So I'm going to focus on that positive opportunity to contribute and encourage everybody in the breakout rooms to really kind of unpick specifically, if we can, if you can bring your knowledge of Exeter, so that the Living Lab and the group that we have can really begin to contribute ideas. How can we imagine this better Exeter, and how can we get there?
So we've got 10 minutes left, and we want to wrap up and if we can briefly come to the panel members again, just for a kind of one sentence each. But before that, it'd be good to get some really brief reflections from those 3 groups. So I'm going to kind of limit that to a minute each, just to kind of a taste of the kind of directions that conversation was going in, that question of what do we start doing differently. So room 1, how we live, I think that was your room. Kate, do you want to take 1 minute just to give us a sense of what was going on?
Okay, yes, for sure. Thank you. Really interesting conversation. Began with everybody feeling really disempowered, disenfranchised, seeing all of these decisions being made without having a voice. Some really interesting modelling from Peter Head about supporting skills and a movement for change. And perhaps building an organisation of Exeter leaders with supporting skills. And we sort of ended with the idea of mobilising a wider group of people and how important it would be for the messaging and to come together and feel that people had a voice, for both Devon County and Exeter City Councils, everybody feeling they have no voice is the thing.
Thank you, Kate. That's really useful. Group 2, how we collaborate. So James or David, can one of you give us a quick summary?
Yeah, thank you, Peter. Yeah, some great conversations. It's agreed communication and collaboration is the key for moving forward, and this needs to be done in an open, transparent way. There was discussion of how we need to widen the communication as well, perhaps reach across the aisle at times. We can't get everyone, but we also need to be conscious that we can't create division, particularly in an emergency situation. There might be the risk of division. Glenn shared how previously Exeter City Futures have tried to imagine what a great city looks like, which is a great thought exercise to perhaps bring people together in a collaborative thought experiment. What else was there? Yeah, of course, the opportunity for trans multidisciplinary conversation. Will highlighted how we could connect psychologists and behavioral scientists, those marketing and PR, and bring them to the conversation as well, to see how they could bring their expertise and techniques and approaches to the conversation. So yeah, really good conversation, folks. Thanks.
Thank you, James. And group 3 was how we adapt. So this was the group I was in. We had a really wide-ranging discussion thinking about how Exeter can adapt, thinking about questioning what that even means and what is what kind of terminology we're using. It means different things to different communities. We talked about kind of significant infrastructural, practical changes around transport, around health. And we also talked kind of slightly more kind of esoteric ideas around, we were just getting into a conversation about, let's make the buses really beautiful, put music on them, also things about, making them free, but, really leaning into this idea of making those choices ones that people want to make, which I think was a really nice way to end that conversation. Obviously, this is not the end of this conversation. And one of the things we talked about as well is, do we need to do these kind of events differently? Are we just kind of falling into that pattern of, oh, let's hold a Zoom event? These things we need to do differently. And this is obviously an ongoing conversation. But I think that question of what do we start doing differently feels like one we need to keep asking. Before I hand back to Kate to just get some reflections from the final reflections from the panel, I'm going to run that poll again, which hopefully you'll be able to see. So it's the same question again. But now, so after this event, how do you feel about what happened at COP26? So again, from very positive right down to deeply frustrated, and also an option to say, I still don't really know what happened. So again, it's anonymous, but it'll be interesting to see, whether there has been any shift in that throughout the event. Not that there needs to be. This is not our evaluation of this event, and we want everyone to come away very positive about COP. I think it's really important that we honour how we feel about that frustration, that disappointment, but also notice how others are feeling as well. So I'll give you a couple more seconds just to finish your answers to that. And if you can't see it, feel free to put in the chat how you're feeling about COP now. Right, I'll finish up there and share the results. So it looks pretty similar, although I know that Peter had to go and he was the one who admitted to being cautiously optimistic. So we have at least one more cautiously optimistic person, but still that kind of sense of disappointment. And I think we, when we're talking about COP, we all need to kind of acknowledge that. So thank you for doing that. Kate, can you guide us through some very brief reflections from our panel? Thank you.
Yes, and thanks everybody for that. Glenn, I'm going to come to you and pick up straight away that you'd really like to see non-activists attending these sorts of events. And I'm going to counter that by saying every single person needs to become an activist, absolutely, this moment now, to make change happen. But then I would. Can you, after this discussion, I mean, I'm looking at how we live, action is the antidote to despair. Thank you for one of our group from that. And how we collaborate, communication being open and transparent, and to broaden the scope of that. And for adaptation, I love the idea I've just got around, let's make buses beautiful. In terms of your practice, with Exeter City Futures and all of the different whether that's a livable Exeter, which shapes so much about how Exeter looks as a city, the growth agenda, how do you feel today, and that connection with other ideas, how do you feel about that today? Sorry, that's a question for you, Glenn.
Oh, for me? Sorry, I was writing replies to chat messages. That's the trouble with these things. I think my comment was poorly phrased, and I don't mean that I don't want activists involved in any way, But there are a lot of people, who are not activists and are not engaged and are either threatened or confused. And us making progress will mean that they are much more involved in that debate. And for some reason, which we need to understand much better than we currently do, they're not, despite what we all know as being something which is incredibly important. And I think that's really the point I kind of wanted to make at the end, is that I think that's a problem for us as a relatively small group still to try to work out the answer to.
So communication and the importance of extending that to as broad a network as we can is one of the major issues for Exeter City Council's community engagement programme. It's an acknowledged gap in this part of their statutory requirements, and with the local plan just being sent out to everybody to contribute to, and so many people not understanding the language or the context or the implications of that, I think there are serious questions for the democratic process for sure. In that, Jill, I'm going to swing to you as someone I feel is an activist. How have you found today, and do you think there are onward conversations that might be had or might be useful?
I certainly hope so, Kate. I think it has been a useful conversation. It was great hearing from you, May, about the situation in schools, and I was involved in teaching climate peer educators a while ago, and that is not now happening as far as I know in schools, but resources for teachers sounds like a missing area, and support. And as you say, Glenn, polarization doesn't always help. On the other hand, you can't teach climate in on the one hand it's good, on the one hand it's bad, which is one of the things that came out lately. So some good resources there would be terrific. And I also wonder whether we could do better at hearing voices from the Global South. As I put in the chat, I really felt when I was in Glasgow that I hadn't heard them speak properly. Quite a lot of people from countries most affected by climate change didn't have their visas to come to COP, or they couldn't afford it. And I hadn't heard them saying, what you are doing is killing us. And some of the, we've heard it's bad enough in Scotland. So what it's like with rampaging hurricanes, I don't know. So I think we do need to take those voices into account as well. And I would like to see an Exeter in which we are looking at thriving in our place, like Kate Rower says, very much inclusively, and also thriving in terms of our relationships with the rest of the world.
Thank you, Jill. And I want to head to May, just in the final minute, to make sure we get your voice as part of this, because so many people have referred to the importance of what Fridays for Future is achieving. And let's not forget that you will inherit the planet that we are creating now. So I'm handing over to you for the last word, May. I'm going to ask you to unmute as well, sorry.
You're muted still.
Yeah, that's good.
That's good. That's good.
We can't hear you, I'm afraid, May. If you can share your thoughts in the chat, it'd be really nice to hear what you wanted to say. Apologies, we couldn't make that out. Thank you, Kate, for steering us through that. And we are now bang on 5 o'clock. Thank you, everyone, so much for sticking with us. I just wanted to pick up, there was a really interesting point in the chat from Gabrielle, who said that they haven't attended something like this before, but weren't clear on the next action to take. So I think certainly for me, the action for us all to take is that question of what do we need to do differently, and take that to everything we go on to from here. We'll share a follow-up email with links to how to find out about all of the different organisations involved here. I want to say thank you to the Living Lab, Resilience Brokers, to Exeter City Futures, Exeter City Council, all of our panelists. So we'll share all of that information, so won't go into it now. Let's keep that question going, but I don't think we have a clear, we're not prescribing what that looks like, but that's a question we need to take forward. What do we do differently, and how do we make sure we're acting, acknowledging that we are now in a post COP26 world and what we want that to be. So thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Thanks so much, Kate, for expertly steering us through all of that, to our panelists, and thanks to all of you for contributing. That was really fascinating and really, really useful. So do stay tuned for the follow-up email with more resources, and yeah, enjoy the rest of your days.